Moscow, May 1, 1978. 3 British intelligence officers marched in formation through Red Square. They wore Soviet Army uniforms. They carried concealed cameras. 400 genuine soldiers surrounded them, none aware that the men at their shoulders were enemy operatives. The target, newly unveiled SS-20 nuclear missiles capable of striking Western Europe in minutes. The method, infiltration so complete that Soviet commanders would review their own security footage for weeks without detecting the breach. This was Operation False Flag. The intelligence would reshape NATO's nuclear strategy. But for the operatives who pulled it off, success came with a cost measured in fractured identities and psychological damage that no debrief could repair. The 3 MI6 officers selected for Operation False Flag were not career spies. The oldest was 31, the youngest 26. All had joined the Secret Intelligence Service within the previous 5 years, recruited from military intelligence units where they demonstrated a particular talent: the ability to disappear into foreign environments without trace. What made them valuable wasn't physical courage or combat training. It was psychological flexibility. MI6's behavioral assessment unit called it identity fluidity, the capacity to adopt and inhabit a false identity so completely that the performance became indistinguishable from reality. During selection trials at Fort Monkton, candidates underwent 72-hour immersion exercises where they lived as fabricated personas while interrogators attempted to break their cover. The 3 officers chosen for False Flag never slipped. Not once. By spring of 1978, all 3 were fluent in Russian with native-level proficiency. They'd spent 18 months embedded in émigré communities, perfecting regional accents and absorbing Soviet military culture through defector testimonies and intercepted communications. One operative had memorized the entire Red Army field manual. Another could recite Brezhnev's May Day speeches from memory. Their capability was this: they could think like Soviet soldiers, walk like them, react to authority like them. Most critically, they could suppress every Western behavioral tic. The unconscious body language, the cultural reflexes, the tiny signals that separate native from foreigner. Intelligence services had tracked the SS-20 deployment for 16 months. By March 1978, SIS concluded that photographic intelligence from ground level during the May Day parade represented the only opportunity to document the missile's guidance system configuration before it entered operational deployment. The authorization for infiltration came in late March. The operatives had 32 days to become undetectable. MI6 called this the denial and deception doctrine. The logic was straightforward. Create false information so convincing that when the enemy discovers the deception, they question their own security apparatus more than the falsified data. The operation fit this doctrine perfectly. Soviet military intelligence would spend years investigating how 3 British operatives penetrated Red Square security. The investigation itself would damage institutional confidence more than the stolen intelligence. The obstacles made conventional penetration impossible. First, the May Day Parade Regiment was drawn from the Taman Guards Division. Elite ceremonial troops vetted by both GRU Military Intelligence and KGB 2nd Chief Directorate. Every soldier's identity was verified through multiple channels. Second, the regiment assembled 6 weeks before the parade for intensive rehearsals. Operatives would need to infiltrate during this preparation period, meaning they'd face daily scrutiny from the same commanders and soldiers. Third, security protocols required soldiers to present internal passports, military identification books, and unit transfer orders at 3 separate checkpoints. Any inconsistency would trigger immediate detention. Despite these challenges, planners identified an opportunity. Soviet bureaucracy was simultaneously rigid and chaotic. Units transferred soldiers constantly, often with incomplete paperwork. If documentation appeared authentic enough, officers would approve transfers rather than challenge Moscow's administrative apparatus. The trigger for the operation was confirmation in early April that the SS-20 missiles would be displayed on mobile launchers during the parade's military hardware segment. Within 18 days, all elements would be in position. But first, the operatives needed documentation that would survive GRU scrutiny. During the final week before insertion, the lead operative experienced what handlers call legend drift. His cover identity was Senior Sergeant Dmitry Volkov, originally from Krasnoyarsk, transferred from the 338th Motor Rifle Regiment. He'd spent 3 weeks living as Volkov, wearing his uniform, reading his fabricated letters from a fictional wife, memorizing details of a childhood that never happened. On April 19th, during a training session at the safe house outside Helsinki, he responded to his real name with a 2-second delay. The case officer noted it in the operational log. Subject exhibited identity confusion, assessed as acceptable within operational parameters, but flagged for post-mission psychological evaluation. The operative later described the sensation as standing between 2 mirrors, unable to determine which reflection was real. But the mission continued. Intercepted KGB communications from April 24th revealed General Secretary Brezhnev discussing the parade arrangements with his daughter. He mentioned concern about the weather, hoping it wouldn't rain during his speech. Analysts noted nothing operationally relevant. The General Secretary was 71, suffering from the arterial sclerosis that would kill him 4 years later. When the British operatives marched past the reviewing stand where he stood, capturing images of weapons designed to incinerate Western European cities, Brezhnev would be 15 meters away, unaware that his security apparatus had failed. The human impact of that failure would destroy careers and reputations across Soviet military intelligence. By April the 28th, 1978, the operation entered its execution phase. A GRU officer in the Taman Division Personnel Section received transfer orders for 3 soldiers from the 338th Motor Rifle Regiment in Siberia. The window was 72 hours before the regiment's final formation inspection. The infrastructure required to insert 3 operatives into the Soviet military parade apparatus took MI6 14 months to construct. The foundation was documentation, not merely forged, but historically consistent across multiple bureaucratic systems. The identity packets began with genuine Soviet military identification books acquired through a compromised quartermaster in the Leningrad military district. The books were authentic, blank, and serial numbered within the range allocated to Siberian military units in 1976. MI6's documentation specialists filled them with service records for 3 fictional soldiers, backdating entries to create 2-year service histories. Each entry matched the handwriting style, ink types, and administrative stamps used by specific units during specific months. Senior Sergeant Dmitry Volkov's identification book contained 17 separate entries documenting training courses, duty assignments, and performance evaluations. The entries referenced real officers commanding real units during the specified time periods. If Soviet counterintelligence investigated, the names would check out. The officers existed, the units existed. Only the soldiers were fiction. The transfer orders carried Directive Number 473-L, indicating priority reassignment for ceremonial duties. MI6's source network had identified this designation as requiring expedited processing with reduced scrutiny. The orders were printed on authentic Soviet military letterhead stock, complete with watermarks and security fibers. The signature block bore the forged authorization of Colonel General Yevgeny Ivanovsky, first deputy commander of the Siberian military district. The general's actual signature had been obtained from a separate MI6 operation 6 months earlier. Equipment presented unique challenges. The operatives needed cameras capable of capturing technical specifications from 15 to 20 meters while concealed in military uniforms that would be inspected before the parade. Technical services developed buttonhole cameras, modified MI6 subminiature units reduced to 12 millimeters in diameter and 28 millimeters in length. Each unit was sewn into the uniform's third button position, with the lens disguised as decorative metalwork on the button surface. The shutter was triggered by pressing the button inward against a spring mechanism. Film capacity was limited to 36 exposures per camera. The operatives would need to select their shots carefully. Communication systems relied on dead drops rather than active transmission. The operatives would have no contact with handlers from insertion until exfiltration. Any intelligence gathered would remain with them until they crossed the Finnish border. This eliminated radio intercept risk, but meant the operatives operated with complete autonomy and zero backup. Escape routes were predetermined with brutal simplicity. After the parade, the operatives would change into civilian clothing at a safe house maintained by a Finnish national working for MI6. The house was located at 17 Bolshaya Gruzinskaya Street, a residential building where the caretaker had been cultivated 3 years earlier. From there, the operatives would travel separately to Leningrad, then cross into Finland at the Vaalimaa checkpoint using diplomatic courier credentials. Total exfiltration timeline: 48 hours from parade conclusion to border crossing. The planning consumed 11 months. By April 26, 1978, all documentation had been inserted into Soviet military channels through compromised administrative personnel. The operatives had 6 days before the May Day parade. They had 72 hours before they would cease being British intelligence officers and become Soviet soldiers. April 28, 1978. At 1300 hours, 3 men in Soviet Army uniforms crossed from Finland into the USSR at Vainikkala. Their papers identified them as soldiers returning from compassionate leave. Border guards examined their documentation for 8 minutes. The identification books passed inspection. The guards stamped entry permits and waved them through. The first critical test came at Moscow's Leningradsky railway station. Military police conducted random document checks on soldiers transiting through the capital. The operatives had rehearsed this scenario 40 times. When approached, they responded with the exact mixture of boredom and mild anxiety that genuine soldiers displayed toward military police authority. Their documents were checked. Their stories, returning from leave, reporting to ceremonial duties, were accepted without question. Elapsed time: 4 minutes. Over the next 30 hours, the operatives separately made their way to the Taman Division Assembly Area in Alabino, 40 kilometers west of Moscow. The base housed the Guards Regiment selected for the May Day parade. Security at the gate was intensive. Each soldier presented orders, identification, and underwent equipment inspection. The operatives fabricated transfer orders cited Directive 473-L. The gate officer checked the directive number against a master list, found it valid, and processed the paperwork. The operatives were assigned to separate companies within the regiment's 2nd Battalion. The first real challenge was integration. Soviet military culture operated on informal hierarchies as much as formal rank structure. New arrivals were scrutinized by their peers. The operatives needed to establish credibility immediately. The lead operative, now Senior Sergeant Volkov, entered his assigned barracks at 1800 hours on April 29th. 23 soldiers occupied the space. The talking stopped when he entered. He responded exactly as his training dictated: minimal eye contact, selecting a bunk near the rear, beginning to unpack his kit without seeking permission or acknowledgement. After 2 minutes, a corporal approached and asked where he'd transferred from. Volkov responded with a prepared biography. 338th Motor Rifle Regiment, Krasnoyarsk. The corporal knew someone who'd served in that region. He asked specific questions about commanders and base layout. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. The corporal wasn't conducting counterintelligence. He was establishing social connection. But any inconsistency would trigger suspicion. Volkov deployed the misdirection strategy developed during training. He acknowledged the question, provided a partial answer, then redirected with a question of his own about Moscow and parade preparations. The corporal, eager to display insider knowledge, shifted into explaining the regiment's rehearsal schedule. The crisis passed. Over the following 3 days, all 3 operatives successfully integrated into their respective units. They marched in rehearsals. They memorized formation positions. They learned the specific cadence and style required for the parade's ceremonial march. One near miss occurred when a battalion political officer questioned one operative's knowledge of recent party directives. The operative had memorized Pravda articles from the previous 6 months. He quoted passages verbatim. The political officer was satisfied. The questioning stopped. By May 1st, 0400 hours, the regiment assembled for final equipment inspection. Each soldier's uniform was examined for conformity to parade standards. The buttonhole cameras passed undetected. The inspecting officer noted the decorative buttons as appropriately polished. The operatives were cleared for parade duty. The window for execution opened at 0600 hours. The regiment marched from Alabino to the Moscow staging area. The operatives were positioned in formation, separated across different companies, but each with clear sight lines to the reviewing stand where military hardware would be displayed. They had rehearsed their march positions 38 times during the previous 72 hours. Every step was choreographed. Every head turn timed. The cameras would activate during a specific 8-second window when the formation passed the missiles. What Soviet intelligence didn't know was that MI6 had obtained the parade's exact choreography through a separate penetration operation. The operatives knew precisely when their formation would align with the SS-20 launchers. They knew the reviewing stand positions. They knew the camera angles that would capture technical specifications. Everything depended on executing the plan without variation. May 1st, 1978, 0847 hours. The Taman Guards Regiment assembled in formation 3 blocks from Red Square. 400 men stood in ranks, uniforms immaculate, weapons polished for ceremonial inspection. The 3 British operatives occupied positions in the 2nd, 4th, and 7th companies. From external observation, they were indistinguishable from genuine Soviet soldiers. Soviet military bands played patriotic marches. Commanders conducted final inspections. General, Secretary Brezhnev, and the Politburo were already positioned on Lenin's mausoleum reviewing stand. Overhead, KGB surveillance teams monitored from surrounding buildings. The security apparatus was absolute. Yet 3 enemy intelligence officers stood within it, undetected. At 0900 hours, the regiment began its march into Red Square. The operatives moved in perfect synchronization with their units. Their weapon handling was precise. Their cadence matched the soldiers flanking them. Every movement had been drilled until it became automatic. Muscle memory that required no conscious thought. The parade route took them past the reviewing stand in a carefully choreographed sequence. First, infantry units. Then, motorized columns. Finally, the strategic weapons display, the segment showcasing Soviet military power. The SS-20 mobile launchers were positioned for maximum visual impact, their missiles elevated at 45-degree angles. guidance systems exposed for the cameras documenting the parade for state television. The first operatives formation reached the designated position at 0917 hours. He was 38 meters from the reviewing stand. The SS-20 launcher was directly in his sight line. The formation continued its march, 5 seconds to optimal camera position. The operative maintained his forward gaze, his expression blank, his posture regulation perfect. At the precise moment rehearsed, he shifted his torso 5 degrees left, a movement that appeared as natural adjustment to formation spacing, but aligned his buttonhole camera with the missile's guidance assembly. He pressed the button inward. The camera shutter activated. The first photograph captured the SS-20's targeting computer housing and telemetry antenna configuration. He pressed again. Second photograph. Warhead mounting structure and separation mechanisms. Third press, propulsion system interface points. Each photograph was separated by 0.8 seconds, the minimum interval required for the camera mechanism to advance the film. Total exposure time, 2.4 seconds. Then he returned to standard march position. The second operatives formation reached optimal position at 0919 hours. He was 42 meters from the launcher, farther than planned, but within the camera's focal range. His sequence was identical. Positioning adjustment, 3 shutter activations, return to formation. His photographs captured the missile's lateral stabilization fins and mobile launcher hydraulic systems. Elapsed time, 2.6 seconds. The third operative encountered a complication. His formation spacing had compressed during the march. He was partially blocked by the soldier in front of him. When his unit reached the designated position at 0921 hours, his sight line to the launcher was obstructed. He had a decision window of approximately 3 seconds. Breaking formation to acquire a clear shot would draw attention. Maintaining position would result in obscured photographs. He made the tactical choice. He angled his body as if adjusting his weapon sling, a movement consistent with parade discipline. The adjustment gave him a 40% clear sight line. He activated the camera 3 times, knowing the photographs would be partially blocked, but potentially salvageable through technical analysis. The movement drew a brief glance from the soldier beside him. The operative maintained his expression. The soldier returned attention forward. The moment passed. Total intelligence collection time across all 3 operatives, 7.4 seconds. The cameras had functioned perfectly. The film contained technical specifications that Western intelligence had sought for 18 months. The operatives had achieved their primary objective while marching in formation, surrounded by genuine Soviet soldiers, under the direct observation of the Soviet leadership and security apparatus. The regiment completed its parade route and exited Red Square at 0943 hours. The operatives marched with their units back to the staging area. They were dismissed with the rest of the regiment at 1100 hours. This was the critical transition point, the moment when they would separate from Soviet military control and initiate exfiltration. The plan required them to change from military uniforms to civilian clothing, then disperse through Moscow as unremarkable citizens. The safe house at 17 Bolshaya Gruzinskaya Street was 4.2 kilometers from the staging area. They would travel separately, using different routes and public transportation. The lead operative departed first. He walked 3 blocks from the staging area, entered a public restroom, and changed into civilian clothes in a toilet stall. The uniform went into a canvas bag he'd concealed earlier. He exited, now dressed as a factory worker, and boarded a metro train toward the city center. Transit time to the safe house, 22 minutes. He arrived at 1200 hours. The Finnish caretaker, who knew him only as a courier for a fictitious import company, granted him access without comment. The second operative's exfiltration was complicated by a random document check on the metro. Military police were conducting spot inspections, checking that soldiers weren't absent without leave. He'd already changed into civilian clothes. When approached, he presented civilian identification papers, authentic documents obtained through MI6's network, identifying him as a Ukrainian factory supervisor visiting Moscow. The papers were examined and returned. He continued to the safe house. Arrival time, 12:34 hours. The third operative encountered no complications. He reached the safe house at 1300 hours. All three were now consolidated in a secure location, out of uniform, and holding the most valuable photographic intelligence MI6 had obtained from inside the Soviet Union in 5 years. They remained at the safe house for 16 hours, waiting for the predetermined extraction window. During this period, they couldn't communicate with London. The operation's success or failure was unknown to SIS headquarters. The operatives sat in separate rooms, processing what they'd just accomplished and what it had required of them psychologically. May 2nd, 0500 hours. The operatives departed the safe house separately, now using diplomatic courier credentials that identified them as employees of the Finnish embassy. This was the highest-risk portion of exfiltration. If Soviet counterintelligence had detected the infiltration, roadblocks would be established at likely exit points. The operatives had contingency plans for capture, including legend stories designed to withstand initial interrogation and delay compromise of MI6's broader network. The first operative took a train to Leningrad. Transit time, 8 hours. He crossed into Finland at Vaalimaa checkpoint at 1700 hours using diplomatic papers. Border guards examined his credentials for 3 minutes. He was cleared through. He was now on Finnish soil, outside Soviet jurisdiction. The second and third operatives traveled separately via different routes. Both crossed at Vaalimaa within the following 6 hours. By May 3rd, 0200 hours, all three were consolidated at a safe house in Helsinki. The operation was complete. They'd infiltrated a Soviet military parade, photographed strategic nuclear weapons, and exfiltrated without detection. Total time inside the USSR, 96 hours. But standing in that Helsinki safe house, the operatives experienced what the psychological assessment would later identify as acute identity disorientation. They'd spent 4 days as Soviet soldiers, inhabiting those identities so completely that aspects of their actual personalities had been suppressed. One operative later described needing several minutes to remember his real name. Another reported difficulty switching back to English. Russian responses came more naturally. The mission had succeeded, but the psychological cost was immediately evident. By May 4th, 0900 hours, Soviet military intelligence understood that something had occurred during the May Day parade. The realization came not from counterintelligence analysis, but from routine administrative processing. The Tomen Guards Division Personnel Section attempted to file post-parade documentation for soldiers who'd participated. 3 names from the roster, Volkov, Mikhailov, and Sokolov, didn't match any records in the military database beyond the transfer orders that had authorized their assignment. Initial investigation assumed administrative error. The 338th Motor Rifle Regiment in Krasnoyarsk was contacted. They confirmed they'd never transferred any soldiers to Moscow. They had no personnel matching the names or service numbers. The transfer orders were examined more closely. The directive number was valid. The signature appeared authentic. But the soldiers didn't exist. By May 7th, the investigation escalated to GRU headquarters. Every lead ended in carefully constructed dead ends, suggesting professional intelligence tradecraft. The identification books were authentic military stock. The uniforms were genuine issue. The transfer orders had been processed through legitimate channels. Someone had penetrated Soviet military bureaucracy with sufficient access to create fictional soldiers who could pass multiple security checkpoints and march in the nation's most visible ceremonial event. The investigation consumed resources for 6 months. Over 200 personnel in military administrative positions were interrogated. Security protocols were revised. The GRU's confidence in its own vetting procedures was permanently damaged. The denials from Western intelligence services were transparent to those in the field. MI6 fingerprints were evident in the operation's sophistication. But transparency wasn't the point. The point was demonstrating that Soviet security could be penetrated at its most visible moment. Official reactions were muted. No public statement was issued. The Soviet press never mentioned the incident. Western intelligence services maintained complete deniability. The 3 operatives who'd executed the mission were never identified by Soviet counterintelligence. Their real names remained unknown to Moscow until classified files were opened decades later. The tactical objective was accomplished. MI6 obtained detailed photographic intelligence of the SS-20 mobile launcher system. The photographs captured technical specifications that confirmed Western assessments of the missile's range, accuracy, and warhead configuration. The intelligence gained included guidance system architecture, telemetry antenna positioning, and launcher stabilization mechanisms, details that couldn't be obtained through satellite imagery or signals intelligence. Secondary benefits exceeded original planning estimates. The operation revealed vulnerabilities in Soviet military administration that MI6 exploited in subsequent operations. The psychological impact on Soviet intelligence services, the demonstrated fact that their security could be compromised even during their most controlled event, created lasting institutional paranoia that diverted resources toward internal security reviews. What it cost was measured across multiple dimensions. Diplomatically, the operation occurred during a period of détente. If exposed publicly, it would have complicated ongoing arms control negotiations. MI6 calculated this risk as acceptable given the intelligence value. The calculation proved correct only because the operation remained deniable. Operationally, the operation revealed tradecraft elements that forced MI6 to adapt methods in other theaters. The type buttonhole camera technology, once the Soviets became aware such devices existed, was rendered less effective. The specific documentation techniques used to create the false identities required modification once Soviet counterintelligence understood the methodology. For the 3 operatives, the consequences were documented in psychological evaluations conducted over the following 2 years. All 3 exhibited symptoms consistent with identity disassociation. One operative required extended leave from active operations. Another was medically retired from field work. The third continued in intelligence work, but reported persistent difficulty maintaining personal relationships. The skills that made him effective at maintaining cover stories had damaged his capacity for authentic emotional connection. MI6's assessment was that the intelligence gained justified the operational risks. Whether this proved correct would become clear over the following decade, as NATO adjusted its nuclear deployment strategy in response to the SS-20 threat. The intelligence contributed to decisions that shaped European security architecture through the end of the Cold War. Was this operation justified espionage or a violation of Soviet sovereignty that risked escalating Cold War tensions? One perspective argues the intelligence was essential. The SS-20 represented a fundamental shift in nuclear balance. intermediate-range missiles capable of striking Western European capitals with minimal warning. NATO's defensive posture depended on accurate intelligence about Soviet capabilities. Without the photographs obtained during Operation False Flag, Western military planners would have operated with incomplete information about a weapons system that threatened millions of lives. The three operatives volunteered for the mission. They understood the risks. Their psychological struggles were tragic, but don't invalidate the strategic necessity of the operation. The alternative perspective argues that infiltrating a military parade during peacetime represented an escalation of intelligence operations that increased Cold War dangers. The mission could have failed catastrophically, resulting in Soviet propaganda victories and diplomatic crises. The psychological damage to the operatives demonstrates that intelligence agencies were willing to sacrifice individual well-being for marginal gains in strategic information. The SS-20 specifications would have become known through other means eventually. The operation's tactical success doesn't justify its human cost. The answer reveals more about your worldview than about Operation False Flag. If you believe intelligence gathering is inherently justified when national security is at stake, the operatives were heroes who made necessary sacrifices. If you believe espionage operations carry moral weight beyond their strategic outcomes, the operation represents the dehumanizing cost of Cold War competition. What's your take on whether the psychological damage to three intelligence officers was an acceptable price for nuclear weapons intelligence? Did MI6's decision to proceed with the operation demonstrate necessary ruthlessness or institutional callousness toward its own personnel? Drop your perspective in the comments. If this story made you reconsider the human cost behind intelligence operations that appear in history as footnotes, hit that like button and share this with someone interested in the reality of Cold War espionage.